Carol stood alone by the deserted highway, clutching a makeshift cardboard sign that read Red Springs in hastily scribbled letters. She had used a piece of charcoal from the remnants of her campfire the previous night to scrawl the town's name. The sign was smudged and worn, much like her spirit after days on the road. Only a few cars and the occasional semi-truck roared past her on this lonely stretch of road, none slowing down for a second glance. The emptiness around her was suffocating, the quiet so profound that it seemed to echo the vastness of her isolation. As she gazed into the distant horizon, her mind began to wander back to that fateful day, the one that changed everything. Her chest tightened, and she blinked, snapping herself out of the reverie before the memories swallowed her whole. A sudden rumble pulled her back to the present. Her heart skipped a beat as a family van slowed down and pulled to the side of the road, gravel crunching under its tires. The window rolled down to reveal a woman with kind, concerned eyes and a warm smile. "Hey there, are you headed to Red Springs?" the woman asked, her voice gentle but filled with curiosity. Carol swallowed and nodded, her throat too dry and emotions too tangled to find words. The woman glanced back at the interior of the van, which was packed to the brim with sleeping children and bags strewn about. "I just came back from a school field trip," she explained, motioning to the dozing kids. "I'm really sorry, but there's not much space left. I wish I could offer you a ride." Carol smiled faintly, understanding the situation. She wasn't expecting much. Just a small act of kindness was enough to lighten the burden of her solitude. The woman seemed to sense her need for something, even if it wasn't a ride. "Would you like some water? Maybe a snack? I can't give you a lift, but I can at least do that." Carol hesitated for a moment, but then nodded, feeling a flicker of gratitude in her chest. "Yeah, thank you. That would be great." The woman hopped out of the van and moved to the back, rummaging through a cooler. "Let's see what I've got," she muttered to herself, eventually pulling out 2 water bottles, a sandwich wrapped neatly in a Ziploc bag, and a ripe banana. She handed them over with a soft smile. "Here you go." "It's not much, but I hope it helps," she said. And Carol took the offerings, her fingers brushing the coolness of the bottles. She smiled, a genuine if small smile, and whispered, "Thank you. This means a lot." The woman patted her arm lightly, her expression warm and maternal. "I hope someone comes by soon to pick you up. It's not a safe place to be stranded." She gave Carol one last glance of concern before getting back into the van. "Take care of yourself," she called out as she pulled away, the van disappearing down the road in a cloud of dust. Carol stood there for a moment, holding the water and food, feeling a strange sense of comfort despite her situation. The kindness of a stranger was sometimes all it took to remind you that you weren't completely alone in the world. Carol leaned her cardboard sign against her dusty backpack and decided it was time to take a break. The heat was relentless, and the stretch of highway seemed to go on forever, with no end in sight. She found a small patch of dirt and dry grass by the side of the sun-baked road and sat down, letting out a tired sigh. Facing away from the sparse traffic, she unwrapped the tuna sandwich she'd been given earlier. The first bite was simple but satisfying, and she washed it down with the cool water, savouring the relief it brought to her parched throat. In this heat, the water felt like a rare luxury. As she ate, something caught her eye on the horizon, a shimmering, distorted image, almost like a mirage. She squinted against the glare of the sun, her pulse quickening with cautious hope. It was a vehicle, its outline wavering in the distance due to the heat waves rising from the asphalt. As it drew closer, Carol's heart sped up. She quickly stood, brushing off her pants, and tried to make herself as visible as possible. The vehicle soon took shape, an old beat-up Chevy pickup truck. Its faded green paint was chipped and worn, but the sight of it brought a spark of hope to Carol. The truck slowed down as it approached her, not even bothering to pull over to the shoulder. For a moment she held her breath, unsure of what to expect. The driver, an older man, leaned forward, the brim of his worn cowboy hat casting a shadow over his weathered face. His rough, sun-tanned skin suggested years of outdoor work, and his eyes, though partially hidden, seemed kind. "You looking for a ride, young lady?" he called out in a gravelly voice, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Before Carol could respond, he added with a chuckle, "Hop in, but only if you've got a funny story to share." His laugh was warm, contagious, and immediately put Carol at ease. She felt her nervousness melt away, replaced by relief. The man leaned over and pulled the passenger door open from the inside, his hand rough with age and use. Carol beamed back at him, her face lighting up with gratitude. "Well, I might be able to think of one," she replied, slinging her backpack over her shoulder and hoisting it into the truck's cab. The weight of solitude, which had pressed down on her like the scorching sun, suddenly felt lighter, as if the simple kindness of a stranger could make the whole world seem less lonely. As she settled into the seat, the man tipped his hat slightly. "Name's Kevin Swisher," he said, his voice friendly and familiar. "Spent my morning out at one of the ponds near town, trying to catch some fish. Didn't have much luck, but it's the peace and quiet I'm really after these days." Carol smiled, already feeling a sense of ease around him. "Nice to meet you, Kevin." "I'm Carol," she said, buckling her seatbelt. "I could use some peace and quiet myself." Kevin laughed, the sound rich and full of life. "Well, we've got plenty of that around here," he said, shifting the truck into gear and pulling back onto the road. "So, what's your story, Carol? You heading somewhere special or just passing through?" Carol hesitated for a moment, glancing out the window as the endless road stretched ahead. "I'm headed to Red Springs," she said, her voice quieter now. "Just trying to figure a few things out along the way." Kevin nodded, sensing there was more to her journey than she was letting on. But he didn't push. Instead, he grinned and said, "Well, Red Springs is a fine place to figure things out. I'll get you there in no time." As they chatted, Carol eventually revealed her destination. "I'm heading to the Jacksons' old house," she said, glancing at Kevin to gauge his reaction. Kevin's brow lifted in surprise, his eyes momentarily flicking to her. "The Jacksons' place? Haven't seen anyone there in quite a while. I live just across the street from it, actually," he said, his tone curious. "You sure that's where you're headed?" Carol nodded, though there was a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. "Yeah, it belonged to my family." Kevin didn't press further but gave a slow nod of understanding. As they entered Red Springs, the small town's wide, welcoming streets stretched out before them, framed by tall, majestic pine trees. The trees cast dappled shadows on the road, and Carol found herself mesmerized by the quiet beauty of the place. The golden afternoon sun filtered through the branches, giving the town an almost dreamlike quality. Suddenly, the peaceful moment was interrupted by a loud, jarring screech as Kevin hit the brakes to slow down for a turn. The old Chevy groaned in protest, and Carol couldn't help but wince at the sound. "Yeah, I know," Kevin said with a sheepish grin, shooting her an apologetic look. "She's not as young as she used to be, but she gets me where I need to go." Carol smiled back, feeling a bit of warmth and ease from his friendly demeanor. "Welcome to Red Springs," Kevin declared proudly, gesturing to the right as they passed a row of modest houses. He pointed out a slightly run-down one, its peeling paint and overgrown yard standing in stark contrast to the well-kept homes around it. "That's the Jacksons' place." Carol's gaze followed his hand and her breath caught in her throat. The house was smaller than she remembered from the stories, its once charming exterior now showing the wear of time and neglect. The yard was tangled with weeds, and the shutters hung crookedly, but there was something about it that felt familiar. "Thank you, Mr. Swisher," Carol said, her voice filled with quiet gratitude. She looked over at him, managing a small but genuine smile. "I suppose I'll be seeing more of you since you're my neighbor now." Kevin chuckled, tapping the brim of his hat. "Oh, I'm sure of that, young lady. You take care now, and don't hesitate to holler if you need anything. I'll be right across the way." With a wave, Kevin drove off, leaving Carol standing alone in front of the house. For a moment, she simply stood there, staring at the aging structure. It wasn't grand, not by a long shot, but it was hers now. an unexpected inheritance from a side of the family she hardly knew. A wave of gratitude washed over her, though it was mixed with something else, something heavier. The house, with its faded charm, reminded her of the home she had grown up in. The overgrown lawn, now wild and untamed, brought back memories of her parents' house, where she had spent the past few months. The weight of those memories pressed down on her, tightening her chest. She could almost hear her mother's laughter, see her father tinkering in the garage. But they were gone now, both of them. Carol didn't need to settle in Red Springs or anywhere for that matter. She could have kept moving, let the open road become her refuge, free from attachments and the suffocating weight of her past. But after losing both of her parents so suddenly, the world had started to feel empty, purposeless. It was Aunt Misty, her mother's half-sister, who had convinced her to come here, to Red Springs, to live in the old family home. Aunt Misty, with her soft voice and caring eyes, had gently nudged her in this direction, reminding Carol that sometimes staying put and finding roots again could offer the kind of healing the road couldn't. Carol took a deep breath, staring at the house that now stood before her. She wasn't entirely sure this was what she wanted, but she couldn't deny that some part of her craved stability, something to anchor her in a world that had felt adrift since her parents' passing. Maybe this place, this quiet corner of the world, was what she needed. A place to heal, a place to stop running. With a heavy exhale, she grabbed her backpack and made her way toward the front door, the untamed grass brushing against her legs. She could hear the echo of her aunt's words in her mind, and though she wasn't sure of much, she knew one thing. For now, Red Springs would be home. Before Carol's world fell apart, she was hopeful. Her parents seemed to be on the right path, and she could finally focus on her own life, starting college. But fate had other plans. Carol grew up in a home where alcohol was a constant presence. Her father, Ben, a welder, and her mother, Judy, started small, but their drinking escalated over the years. When Carol was in 4th grade, her father came home too drunk to walk after learning that his construction crew wouldn't be paid for months. What began as occasional beers became a daily ritual. Soon, arguments filled their home. Judy, who never used to drink, began to drown her frustration in wine. What started as a glass after work turned into a bottle a day. Ben stuck to his beer, and by the evening both parents were intoxicated. Judy hid mini bottles of wine around the house, trying to mask her growing dependence. As Carol entered high school, her parents' drinking worsened. Their loud, drunken arguments embarrassed her in front of friends, and every attempt to talk to them was met with denial. Judy insisted that her drinking was just a way to unwind, and Ben enabled her buying wine and cigarettes. Whenever Carol expressed concern, they dismissed her, saying they weren't that kind of drunk. They weren't homeless or jobless. So in their eyes, there was no problem. But to Carol, the problem was undeniable. She couldn't stand seeing them drunk every night. By her sophomore year of high school, the tension reached a boiling point, and her parents briefly separated. Strangely, during their time apart, they didn't drink, which gave Carol hope. She convinced them to try rehab, and for a while it seemed to work. After months of sobriety, they reunited, promising they had changed. Carol believed them. She wanted to believe them. But what happened next would shatter her world entirely. Upon graduating from high school, Carol left for college, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The initial months were blissful. She excelled in her classes, made new friends, and was reassured by the news that her parents had stayed sober. For 6 months, life seemed to be on the right track. Carol frequently called home, her conversations with her parents warm and uplifting. Their voices, steady and clear, gave her hope that they had finally turned a corner. Then came her first spring break. Just as she was preparing for a week of relaxation, she received an unexpected call from the college office, asking her to come in immediately. A sense of dread crept over her. When she arrived, she was met with grave faces and a heartbreaking message. A fire had engulfed her family home. Her mind raced. "What about my parents?" she demanded, her voice trembling. But the office had little information. They urged her to return home as soon as possible. The drive back to her hometown was torturous. Fear gnawed at her, but a fragile thread of hope clung to the idea that her parents might have survived, even if injured. When she finally arrived, her worst fears were confirmed. Her parents hadn't made it. The truth unraveled in agonizing detail. After Carol had left for college, her parents had relapsed into their old drinking habits, hiding it from her during their cheerful phone calls. On the day of the fire, both had been intoxicated. They had fallen asleep with lit cigarettes, and the resulting blaze had taken both their lives. The weight of the tragedy crushed Carol. She had no idea how to continue living in a world that had suddenly become so dark and empty. Carol used what little money she had left to arrange her parents' funeral. With no home to return to and almost no financial support, she found herself at rock bottom. The only lifeline offered came from Aunt Misty, her mother's half-sister, who insisted that Carol stay at the family's old house in Red Springs. Now, standing at the entrance of Aunt Misty's house, Carol took a deep breath before pushing open the front door. The hinges creaked, and she was greeted by a cloud of dust, causing her to sneeze. The house, though sturdy, showed signs of long neglect. Faded wallpaper peeled at the edges, cobwebs draped the corners, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the air. Still, she was relieved to see some old furniture was still intact. An old wooden chair, a table, and a worn-out couch. Carol dropped her backpack onto the chair, the weight of the past few months settling on her shoulders. She stood in the middle of the room, closed her eyes, and took a deep, steadying breath. Inhaling the stale air, she exhaled slowly, trying to gather the strength to face what lay ahead. She wasn't sure what the future would bring, but standing in this house, she felt the first glimmer of resolve. Opening her eyes, she rolled up her sleeves and set her sights on the work ahead. The house needed a lot of care, and so did she, but this was a start, a place to begin again. And with that thought, Carol bent down to pick up a broom, ready to reclaim her life, one small step at a time. Just as Carol was starting to make some progress on the cleanup, an unexpected knock at the door startled her. She froze for a moment, wiping the dust from her hands onto her jeans, and called out, "Who is it?" Her voice carried a note of caution. When she opened the door, she was met by a woman with a kind face and curious eyes. Her smile was warm and welcoming, and there was an immediate sense of ease about her. "I couldn't help but notice someone moving around in here," the woman said cheerfully. "I never thought I'd see anyone in this old place again." Carol, feeling a bit defensive, straightened up. "It's my Aunt Misty's house. She sent me here," she explained, unsure how much she needed to reveal to this stranger. The woman's face softened, her eyes filling with sympathy as she glanced at the state of the house. "Oh, bless your heart. This place has seen better days for sure." She extended a hand. "I'm Maggie, by the way. Margaret, technically, but nobody calls me that. Everyone around here just calls me Maggie." Maggie peeked inside, taking in the dust-covered furniture and cluttered space. She shook her head, clearly noting the disarray. "So, you're planning to stay here? You've got quite the fixer-upper on your hands." Carol, feeling a mixture of embarrassment and determination, shrugged. "It's what I've got. I'll make it work somehow." Maggie's eyes lit up with a gleam of excitement. "Well, how about some help? My family and I can pitch in. It'll be faster and a whole lot more fun, with extra hands." Surprised by the generous offer, Carol opened her mouth to decline, thinking of her limited resources. "I don't know. I'm kind of on a tight budget right now, and Maggie quickly waved her off, cutting her short with a smile and holding up a hand. "Oh, hush. Around here, we don't let money get in the way of helping a neighbor. Red Springs is like one big family. If someone wants to help, they do it because they care, not for payment. Trust me, if anyone around here meant business, you'd know." Carol blinked, taken aback by the overwhelming kindness. She gave a small nod, feeling a bit emotional. "Got it. Thank you. I'm Carol, by the way." Maggie grinned. "Carol, that's a lovely name. Give me just a minute, I'll be right back." Before Carol could process what had just happened, the door swung open again. Maggie had returned, this time with a tall man carrying a toolbox and a bright-eyed young girl. "This is my husband, Kevin," Maggie announced proudly. "He's handy with tools and can fix just about anything. And this little ray of sunshine is our daughter, Anna. Kevin, Anna, meet Carol." Carol couldn't help but chuckle as she looked at Kevin. "Actually, Mr. Swisher and I have already met. He gave me a ride into town." Maggie shot an amused look between the two of them, her hands on her hips. "Well, why didn't you tell me?" she asked, feigning indignation. Kevin gave Carol a playful wink. "I figured I'd let you have the fun of making new friends on your own." The room erupted into laughter, the tension melting away in an instant. Carol felt the warmth of their camaraderie, and the atmosphere lightened, making her feel like she had truly stepped into a community, not just a house. The way Maggie and Kevin interacted was heartwarming. Their easy banter and affectionate teasing spoke of a deep bond. The old couple and their daughter moved through the house like a whirlwind, helping Carol transform the dusty, neglected space into something far more inviting. They were a lively, noisy trio, and their presence filled the house with warmth and energy, making Carol feel more at ease than she had in weeks. Just hours earlier, she'd been filled with dread and uncertainty about the future. Now, surrounded by these kind strangers, it was hard to believe she'd felt so alone. As they worked side by side, Carol felt an unexpected sense of familiarity with them, as if they were old friends instead of people she'd just met. Maybe it was the simplicity of their kindness, or maybe it was how much her life had changed recently. Either way, their presence was a comfort she hadn't realized she needed. By the time the sun began to set, the group had made noticeable progress. The house, though still in need of some work, was starting to feel like a home. They all gathered around the kitchen table, now cleared of dust and clutter, for a simple meal that Anna had whipped up. Maggie glanced around the room, her eyes filled with pride. "We've still got a ways to go," she said with a satisfied smile. "But it already feels cozier, doesn't it? More like a home." Carol returned the smile, her heart swelling with gratitude. The transformation was remarkable. With Anna's delicate doilies draped over the furniture and fresh towels in the bathroom, the house felt more inviting, like a space that had been lived in and cared for. As they settled into their seats, Maggie launched into stories about the town, painting vivid pictures of the local community and the nature that surrounded them. She spoke of berry picking in the nearby woods and the small-town festivals that brought everyone together. Kevin, a man of few words, nodded occasionally, adding a quiet comment or a hum of agreement, while Anna listened, smiling as her mother talked. At one point, Maggie turned to Carol with a playful grin. "Just you wait, Carol. Before long, we'll find you a job and who knows, maybe even a husband." Carol laughed, shaking her head. "Why would I need a husband? I'm doing just fine on my own." Maggie's eyes sparkled with mischief. "Well, most folks find someone eventually. Someone to share life with, start a family, grow old together." Carol's smile faded slightly, her tone more serious. "In my experience, relationships aren't always like that. Sometimes people forget about the ones they love." Maggie's expression softened as she leaned in. "I don't know everything about your past, but this town, it has a way of reminding people of the good in life. Give it some time." The conversation shifted after that, but Maggie's words lingered in Carol's mind. Over the next few days, she found herself settling into the rhythm of Red Springs. The townspeople were refreshingly straightforward, sometimes a bit too blunt, but their honesty was something Carol appreciated. It meant she never had to guess at their intentions, and that brought a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. Before long, she landed a job at the local kindergarten, working as a nanny. The pay wasn't great, but it was enough to get by. And with the unexpected kindness that flowed from her new neighbours, home-cooked meals, hand-me-down clothes, and friendly visits, Carol found herself saving more than she spent. The town was becoming her home, in more ways than she'd anticipated. The people of Red Springs had a way of making Carol feel like she truly belonged. Just the other day, as she walked home from work, old Mr. Olson called out to her with his familiar, welcoming grin. "Finished for the day, Carol?" he asked, leaning on his cane, his eyes twinkling with warmth. "Yes, Mr. Olson," she replied, curious as to what he might want. "Well, why don't you stop by the house for a minute? We've got something for you," he offered, waving her over. Though tired from the day, Carol couldn't resist his invitation. When she reached the front of their home, Mrs. Olson was already there, smiling brightly. By her side were 2 large buckets, brimming with fresh vegetables. "Our garden's been good to us this year," Mrs. Olson said proudly, holding up a massive tomato. "Look at these beauties. If you can't eat them all, you can jar them up. There's nothing like the taste of homemade pickles when the winter sets in. Trust me." Carol stared at the overflowing buckets, momentarily overwhelmed. She wasn't sure how she would get through all of it, let alone where to begin. Sensing her hesitation, Mrs. Olson chuckled softly. "Don't you worry, dear," she reassured her. "Wayne," she gestured to her teenage grandson standing nearby, "will help carry them over to your place." And just like that, Carol found herself with more tomatoes and cucumbers than she knew what to do with. But that was the essence of Red Springs: generosity, community, and always lending a hand. In her short time in the town, Carol had experienced kindness at every turn. Maggie and Anna had even taught her how to tend to her own small garden. With Kevin's help and his trusty old tractor, the once neglected plot of land behind her house was now thriving. Carol had learned the basics of gardening, from watering to weeding, and felt a quiet pride as she harvested her first batch of vegetables. Even Maggie's overly enthusiastic rooster, who seemed to enjoy crowing directly beneath her bedroom window at dawn, had become part of her daily routine. With a rare free day ahead, Carol decided she'd spend the evening canning the vegetables from the Olsons, imagining the comforting soups and stews they'd become in the colder months. The thought of filling her pantry with jars of homegrown goods filled her with a sense of accomplishment. Yet, not everything in Red Springs was quite as open and friendly. In the sea of familiar faces and warm greetings, there was one neighbour who remained a mystery. Just next door to Carol's house lived Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman Carol had yet to formally meet. She'd seen her a few times moving quietly around her property, but their only real interaction had been a brief exchange of glances across the yard. Carol couldn't shake the memory of Mrs. Thompson's sharp, penetrating gaze, a look that seemed to see straight through her. There was a feeling in the air that their paths would cross soon enough. But before that, Carol had someone else to meet. A person she wasn't expecting, but whose presence would soon stir up new questions and answers alike. Carol had always found comfort in routine. Her daily walks to and from work followed the same path, providing a sense of stability. But one evening, a slight detour changed everything. Near Mr. Jones's convenience store, by a green garbage can, she spotted a frail, mud-covered dog. Its ribs were visible through its matted fur as it scavenged through a discarded pizza box, searching for food. The sight tugged at Carol's heart. She had always loved dogs, knowing how much warmth and companionship they could offer. Approaching cautiously, she knelt down and extended her hand, letting the dog sniff her. After a brief moment of hesitation, its tail gave a tentative wag, signaling trust. Moved by the animal's vulnerability, Carol decided she couldn't just leave it there. She removed her scarf, fashioned it into a makeshift leash, and gently led the dog home. Once inside, the dog's first experience of comfort was a warm bath. Carol couldn't help but laugh as the water turned from clear to a murky brown, revealing a golden coat beneath the grime. As she scrubbed away the dirt, she felt a growing attachment. This wasn't just a stray anymore. This was her dog. She decided to name him Chance, a fitting tribute to their unexpected meeting and the new beginning she was offering him. Life with Chance quickly became a joyful, if somewhat chaotic adventure. Frequent vet visits, shopping for dog toys, and experimenting with different foods soon became part of Carol's routine. She discovered that Chance had an unwavering love for tennis balls, and their backyard quickly turned into a playground of endless games of fetch. No matter how many times she threw the ball, Chance would sprint after it with boundless energy, his tail wagging furiously. Her daily routine now had a delightful new twist. Mornings started with jogs in the park, Chance darting after anything that caught his eye, whether it was a squirrel or a drifting leaf. In the evenings, they'd unwind on the couch with Chance curled up beside her as she taught him new tricks. He quickly learned to sit, stay, and even give high fives. But like all dogs, Chance had his quirks. The most notable was his barking. Whenever Carol left the house, Chance would make sure the entire neighborhood knew he was missing her. His sharp, persistent barks echoed down the street until she returned. Despite the noise, the neighbors were forgiving, having been won over by his friendly demeanor. One sunny afternoon, as they were playing fetch in the backyard, Chance's focus abruptly shifted. Mid-leap, just as he was about to catch the tennis ball, he spotted a raccoon rummaging through the garbage bin. His bark thundered through the yard as he raced toward the intruder, valiantly defending his new home. Carol chuckled as she watched him stand guard, proud and protective. In a short time, Chance had brought an unexpected joy to Carol's life, turning her once predictable routine into something far more vibrant. And as she watched him chase off the raccoon, she realized that sometimes the best things come when you least expect them. Suddenly, the door of the house next door flung open, and Mrs. Evelyn Thompson stepped out, her face twisted in irritation. "Can't you keep that dog quiet?" she snapped, pointing an accusing finger at Chance, who was still barking at the now fleeing raccoon. Taken aback, Carol quickly crouched down to soothe Chance, rubbing his back. "I'm really sorry, Mrs. Thompson. He got startled by the raccoon, that's all." But Mrs. Thompson was clearly not appeased. She pursed her lips, her eyes narrowing in frustration, and turned to head back inside. Just as she reached for the door, a softer voice called from within the house. "Wait, Mom!" A younger man appeared, stepping out of the doorway with his hands raised in a calming gesture. He approached Carol, offering her an apologetic smile. "Sorry about that," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Jason. My mum's always been a bit wary of dogs, especially the loud ones." Carol, grateful for his intervention, shook his hand and smiled in return. "I completely understand, Jason. Chance is still adjusting to his new home, and I'm working on his training. I promise I'll do my best to keep the noise down. I really appreciate your understanding." Jason gave her a reassuring nod, glancing briefly at his mother, who stood fuming on the porch. "Don't worry too much about it. She'll get over it," he said in a low voice before retreating back into the house. As the door closed behind them, Carol caught the faint sound of a heated conversation between Jason and his mother. Mrs. Thompson's sharp, agitated voice carried through the crack in the door, and it left Carol wondering whether Chance's barking was the real issue or if something deeper was brewing beneath the surface. Sitting on her porch, Carol's mind whirled. She loved Chance dearly, and the thought of parting with him was unimaginable. But at the same time, she understood her responsibility to maintain peace with her neighbors. The idea of rehoming Chance, while heart-wrenching, crossed her mind, leaving her feeling torn. Carol was so lost in thought that she didn't notice Maggie approaching until her friend's voice snapped her out of her reverie. "What's with the worried face?" Maggie asked, sitting beside her on the porch. Carol sighed, then told Maggie about the incident with Mrs. Thompson. To her surprise, Maggie only chuckled softly, her lips curving into a knowing smile. "Don't take it too personally," Maggie said. "It's not really about Chance. Let me tell you a little history about my sister Evelyn." Carol's eyes widened in surprise. "Your sister?" Maggie nodded. "Yep. Evelyn and I share the same father, William Douglas. He had me with his second wife, Helen, and Evelyn with his first, Mary. We all grew up under the same roof for a while, and our father always hoped we'd be close." She paused, her eyes clouding with the weight of old memories. To keep the family together, he even bought houses for us right across the street from each other. But things didn't turn out the way he hoped. Maggie's tone darkened. After Dad died, he passed at 65, things between us got complicated. There was a lot of bitterness between our mothers, and that carried over to us. The tension just grew, especially after Dad was gone. Disagreements became a regular thing, and one day we had a particularly nasty fight. Evelyn told me she wished I were dead. Carol's eyes widened in disbelief. She really said that? Maggie nodded sadly. She did. That comment was the final straw. We stopped talking, and that rift lasted for over 15 years. I've tried to reconcile over the years, but Evelyn, she's got a lot of pride. And now, with you here and my family being close to you, I think it stirs something in her. Carol was silent for a moment, absorbing the story. The dots began to connect in her mind. Evelyn's anger at Chance wasn't really about the barking. It was more about old wounds and unresolved issues with her sister. Perhaps seeing Maggie's warmth extended toward Carol only intensified Evelyn's feelings of jealousy and resentment. Carol was beginning to understand the neighborhood dynamics, and she thanked Maggie for shedding some light on the situation with Evelyn. Life continued in its usual rhythm: work, quiet evenings, and the occasional visit from neighbors. One evening, however, Anna showed up at her doorstep with a basket overflowing with fresh berries. "Berry season already?" Carol asked, pleasantly surprised. Anna grinned mischievously. "You bet. The forest behind your backyard is full of them. Just be careful not to wander too deep. It's easy to get lost out there." That weekend, feeling a bit adventurous, Carol decided to take Anna's advice. She rummaged through the attic, found an old wicker basket, and set off into the forest with Chance, trotting excitedly beside her. The dense canopy of trees closed around them as they wandered deeper into the woods, and Carol found her mind drifting back to the strained relationship between Maggie and Evelyn. Being an only child, she couldn't imagine harboring such bitterness between siblings, even half-sisters. She tried to push the thought aside, focusing instead on the peaceful task at hand: berry picking. Carol had never gone berry picking before, but she had read enough to know the basics. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. Early morning mist clung to the ground, and the golden sunlight filtered through the treetops, casting an ethereal glow on the forest floor. The beauty of it all made her feel deeply grateful for Aunt Misty, whose decision to send her here was proving more perfect with each passing day. Despite the occasional interruption from cars passing through town the night before, getting up early had been the right choice. She found her first batch of berries near the forest's edge, the vibrant colours practically calling out to be picked. Before she knew it, 2 hours had passed, and her basket was brimming with fresh berries. Chance, always full of energy, darted around chasing insects and occasionally startling Carol with his sudden bursts of barking. Every now and then, he'd disappear into the underbrush, only to reappear from an entirely different direction, tongue lolling and tail wagging. But suddenly, his barking took on a different tone, more distant and urgent. Carol's heart skipped a beat as she realized Chance had wandered much farther away. She followed the sound, weaving through the thick trees until she reached a small, concealed bog. The ground was littered with shriveled cranberries from last season, a reminder of the forest's abundance. Carol placed her berry-laden basket beneath a distinct oak tree, covering it with some leaves for safekeeping before continuing her search for Chance. As the afternoon wore on and the sun began to dip lower in the sky, painting the world in warm oranges and reds, Carol's search led her to something unexpected. Half hidden by dense foliage was the wreckage of an old helicopter, its metal frame twisted and rusted by time. Carol stared in disbelief. How could a helicopter end up deep in the forest? She hadn't wandered too far from the edge, so surely the townsfolk knew about it. But why had no one ever mentioned it? Her concern shifted as Chance's barking became more frantic, coming from within the wreckage. Carol's pulse quickened. She approached the wreck cautiously, her stomach in knots, listening as Chance's barks turned into a mix of whimpers and anxious growls. Something inside the helicopter had caught his attention and possibly trapped him. "Chance!" Carol called, her voice trembling slightly. She climbed closer, her feet sinking into the soft, moss-covered ground as she neared the rusted structure. Through a broken window, she could see Chance inside, his fur bristling as he pawed at something obscured from her view. "What did you find, boy?" she whispered to herself, trying to steady her nerves. As she approached the opening of the helicopter, the eeriness of the place settled over her. The air felt heavy with the weight of forgotten stories, and a chill ran down her spine. Yet, with Chance still barking, Carol knew she couldn't turn back now. She needed to figure out what had captured her loyal companion's attention and why the wreckage of this forgotten helicopter still remained hidden in the heart of the forest. As Carol navigated around the old rusted helicopter, she ran her fingers over its corroded panels, wondering why it had been left abandoned in the forest for so long. Stepping onto a nearby rock for a better view inside, she was startled by a sudden sneeze from within. Her foot slipped, and she tumbled onto the soft forest floor. "Who's there?" she shouted, her heart pounding. Chance whined anxiously beside her, but no one responded. The sneeze had sounded small, like that of a child or a small animal. Summoning her courage, Carol got to her feet and climbed back onto the rock. As she peered into the darkened interior, her breath caught in her throat. Inside the wreckage sat a young girl, no older than 6, her eyes swollen and red from crying. She looked scared and disheveled, huddled in a corner. "Hey there," Carol said gently, trying to keep her voice calm. She reached out a hand toward the girl. "It's okay. I'm here to help. Can you come out?" The little girl hesitated before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. I got stuck. I was curious about the helicopter and crawled inside, but I couldn't get back out." "Did you spend the whole night in here?" Carol asked softly. The girl nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "It got dark and I didn't know what to do. I was so scared." Carol's heart broke at the sight of the freed need shield. She gently pulled her out of the helicopter and wrapped her arms around her, offering comfort. "You're safe now," she murmured. "Let's get you home, and we'll find your parents, okay?" The girl clung to Carol, her small frame trembling. "Can you tell my dad I didn't mean to get lost?" she asked, her voice shaky with a mix of fear and hope. "Of course," Carol reassured her with a smile. "But remember, it's always important to tell someone where you're going. It's easy to get lost out here." As they walked back toward town, Carol couldn't help but think of the child's parents, wondering how they could have let her wander off on her own. She was sure they must be frantic by now, searching for their daughter. The little girl's name was Kelsey, and as they made their way out of the forest, Kelsey eagerly began to talk, perhaps in an effort to shake off her lingering fear. Kelsey explained that she lived in the city with her dad. After seeing pictures of the lake and its graceful swans, she had begged him to take her there. They had planned to visit the nearby forest to listen for cuckoos, but her dad had been too busy with work. Impatient and excited, Kelsey had decided to explore the woods on her own. As Kelsey recounted her little adventure, Carol listened with a mix of concern and admiration for the girl's bravery. By the time they reached Carol's house, the conversation had eased both of them, and Carol nearly forgot that Kelsey's parents were probably out of their minds with worry. "Let's get you cleaned up and fed, then we'll figure out how to get in touch with your dad," Carol said, leading Kelsey inside. She couldn't shake the feeling that while Kelsey's curiosity had gotten the better of her, her father needed a reminder about keeping a closer watch on his daughter. Being a parent wasn't just about providing, it was about ensuring their safety too. Before doing anything else, Carol knew she needed to get some food into Kelsey. The little girl looked exhausted, and after only a few spoonfuls of soup, her eyes drooped shut as she curled up on the couch. Carol gently draped a blanket over her, watching as Kelsey fell into a deep sleep. For a moment, Carol stood there thinking about the best way to handle the situation. She decided to turn to Maggie, who always seemed to know what was going on in town. When Carol told her about Kelsey, Maggie's eyes widened with alarm. "The poor thing! The whole town's been in an uproar looking for her. Her father's frantic." Maggie quickly grabbed her phone. "I'll call the police. They've been searching for hours." Within minutes, police cars arrived at Carol's house, lights flashing but sirens off. Carol rushed outside to meet them, signaling for them to be quiet to avoid waking Kelsia. She explained how she had found the girl in the abandoned helicopter deep in the woods, and the officers listened intently, taking notes and radioing the news back to their station. As the police finished taking her statement, a pickup truck sped into the driveway, screeching to a halt. To Carol's surprise, Evelyn, her usually stern and distant neighbour, jumped out of the passenger seat, her face etched with panic. Jason, her son, followed closely behind. "Where is she?" Evelyn demanded breathlessly. "Is Kelsey here?" Carol, remaining calm, nodded. "She's inside, resting on the couch. She had some soup and fell asleep." But before Carol could finish, Evelyn's worry shifted to suspicion. Her eyes narrowed, and she pointed an accusing finger at Carol. "What did you do to her? Why was she with you?" Carol was taken aback, her mouth opening in shock. She hadn't expected this kind of reaction. Just as she was about to respond, Jason stepped in, gently placing a hand on his mother's arm. "Mum, let's hear the whole story first." One of the police officers quickly intervened. "Mum, Carol found your granddaughter lost in the woods and brought her here to keep her safe." "She's the reason Kelsey is okay," Carol added, trying to ease the tension. "Actually, it was Chance who found her first. He led me to her." Evelyn's expression shifted from anger to confusion. "Chance?" At the sound of his name, Chance bounded over, wagging his tail and nuzzling Evelyn's hand. For a moment, she stared at the golden dog. The same one she'd complained about just days before. The realization dawned on her. This dog had helped save her granddaughter. Her hardened expression softened, her eyes filling with tears. "I'm sorry," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling. "I was so scared. I snapped at you and I shouldn't have. Thank you for taking care of Kelsey." Carol smiled warmly, her earlier tension easing. "It's all right, Mrs. Thompson. We're all just glad she's safe." Together they entered the house. As they approached the couch, Kelsey stirred, her eyes fluttering open. When she saw her father and grandmother, her face lit up, and she threw herself into her father's arms. He hugged her tightly, tears in his eyes. "Daddy, I'm so sorry," Kelsey sobbed. "I won't ever wander off again." As Jason gently brushed Kelsey's hair behind her ear, he spoke softly. "I should be the one apologizing. How about we finally go see those swans and listen to the cuckoo's song?" Kelsey's eyes brightened. "Can we take Chance and Carol with us?" she asked, looking up with hope. Jason's gaze met Carol's and she blushed under his warm smile. "Of course," he said. "If they'd like to come, they're more than welcome." Carol smiled, feeling her cheeks heat up even more. Jason scooped Kelsey into his arms and carried her away, the little girl resting her head on his shoulder. As they left, the officer thanked Carol again, taking a few more notes before heading out. Later that evening, there was a knock on Carol's door. When she opened it, Jason stood there, looking a little unsure. "I never got to properly thank you for finding Kelsey," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Do you mind if I come in?" Carol stepped aside, letting him in. They sat together, chatting about the day and other small things. Jason shared stories about Kelsey and mentioned how he hadn't seen Carol around before. Carol, feeling comfortable in his presence, told him her story, about moving to town and her parents. When she mentioned losing them, Jason's expression softened. "I'm really sorry about that," he said quietly. A brief, awkward silence followed as they both searched for words. Finally, Jason stood up to leave, offering her a small smile. "Thank you again. I mean it. And if you ever need anything, I'm just next door." Carol watched him go, her thoughts swirling. She had heard bits and pieces about Jason's life from Maggie. He had been living apart from his mother, Evelyn, for some time. Maggie had told her that Jason once loved a woman who already had a child when they met. But by the time the child turned 2, the woman left, and Jason had been raising Kelsey on his own ever since. Jason was a quiet, thoughtful man, and though he didn't talk much about his past, Carol had learned he was a talented software engineer specializing in video games. His job allowed him to work remotely, giving him and Kelsey the freedom to travel when they liked. A week later, Carol was in the middle of tidying up when she heard another knock on her door. Her heart skipped a beat as she glanced at her reflection in the mirror. Straightening her shirt, she wondered why Jason might be stopping by again. When she opened the door, she saw him standing there looking a little nervous. He smiled and gave a small wave. "It's Sunday," he said with a hint of teasing in his voice. Carol frowned, confused. "Sunday?" Jason chuckled. "You know, the lake. We promised Kelsey we'd take her to see the swans." Carol slapped her forehead in realization. "Oh no, I completely forgot. I'm so sorry." She had been distracted all week, her mind racing with thoughts that seemed to center around Jason more often than she cared to admit. Soon enough, they were on their way to the lake. Kelsey and Chance ran ahead, laughing and racing each other down the path. The playful barks and giggles filled the air, and Carol found herself smiling, feeling the tension lift. As they strolled toward the lake, Carol glanced over at Jason. "Maggie told me a bit about your past. About Kelsey's mom." Jason's expression softened and he nodded. "Yeah, it's been just the 2 of us for a while now. But I love Kelsey deeply. It doesn't matter whose daughter she is. She's mine." Carol's heart swelled at his sincerity. Through Kelsey's eyes, Jason was a hero, a father who had stepped up to raise a child that wasn't biologically his. And the more Carol got to know him, the more she admired him for it. As they reached the lake, Kelsey's excited squeals filled the air as she spotted the swans gliding gracefully across the water. Carol watched the scene unfold, her heart full, realizing that perhaps this small town, and the people in it, were becoming more important to her than she had ever expected. Here's an improved and more detailed version of your story with added dialogue and description. As they strolled along the path, Carol, who wasn't very tech-savvy, listened with polite interest to Jason's stories about gaming. Kelsey, however, interrupted with a playful grin. "Dad, Carol doesn't play video games, remember? I already asked her." Jason chuckled, giving Carol an apologetic look. "Oh, you're right, Kelsey. Sorry, Carol. I guess I'm a bit rusty at making small talk. It's been a while since I've done this." Carol smiled, feeling her earlier nervousness start to fade. "No worries," she said. "Honestly, I wouldn't mind learning more about them. But I think I'm more curious about, I don't know, something like the length of a swan's neck." Jason's eyebrows raised in amusement. "The length of a swan's neck? That's definitely not something you hear every day." The conversation began to flow more naturally, weaving between quirky topics like the best time to watch a sunset, and even Kelsey's imaginative theory about whether aliens could feel love. As they reached the serene edge of the lake, they found a quiet spot and settled down. Carol pulled out the sandwiches she had packed, and their appetites immediately kicked in after more than an hour of walking. "These look amazing," Jason said, taking one from the basket. Kelsey and her dog, Chance, didn't wait to sit. The pair raced around, chasing each other with the boundless energy that only children and dogs seem to have. Carol sat back, watching them, but her thoughts kept drifting. There was something weighing on her mind, a strange feeling that tugged at her. She glanced at Jason, unsure whether to say anything, but her curiosity about the mysterious helicopter wouldn't leave her alone. She had seen it that day in the forest, and the image still lingered in her mind. But she didn't want to bring up painful memories, especially the one about his daughter's fate. As if sensing her inner turmoil, Jason suddenly broke the silence. "You've been wondering about the helicopter, haven't you?" Carol looked at him, startled. She hadn't expected him to bring it up so casually. I didn't want to pry. It's just that it seemed so out of place. Jason's expression grew more somber. He gazed out over the water, his voice quiet but steady. It's okay. You're not the first to ask. The helicopter had a grim and unsettling history, one tied to a lesser-known chapter of US history in the early 1970s. Back then, the government had been engaged in a covert war on organized crime. It wasn't just the well-known mafia families, but a growing network of corrupt law enforcement officers, business moguls, and even politicians who were deeply entangled in smuggling operations and illegal deals. One such operation, run out of the remote mountains of Appalachia, involved the transportation of high-value goods, including narcotics, weapons, and stolen assets, using untraceable privately owned helicopters. The helicopter that now lay forgotten in the dense forest had once been a part of this underground network. It had been used to ferry contraband across state lines, flying low to avoid detection by radar. The crew, made up of former military pilots who had fallen on hard times, worked for a criminal syndicate that operated just outside the reach of federal law enforcement. They were skilled, and for years they had managed to evade authorities, making their secretive flights deep into the wilderness without issue. But one night in 1973, something had gone terribly wrong. A federal task force, having tracked the movements of the syndicate for months, had been ready to strike. They had received a tip from an informant, a man on the inside who had grown tired of the life and wanted a way out. The informant revealed that a helicopter carrying a particularly valuable shipment was set to land in a remote clearing deep in a national forest. On the night of the operation, the helicopter had been in the air as planned, heading toward its hidden destination. But the task force had miscalculated. Expecting a small exchange, they hadn't realized just how deeply the syndicate was embedded in the area. As the helicopter made its approach, they had been ambushed, not by federal agents, but by members of a rival criminal faction who had also learned of the operation through the informant, who had been playing both sides. A brief, intense firefight had broken out in the middle of the forest, and in the chaos, the helicopter had been hit. The pilot had tried to make an emergency landing, but lost control, crashing into the trees. The rival faction, realizing the situation was about to spiral out of control, had fled the scene, leaving the helicopter wreckage and its cargo behind. By the time the authorities arrived, the crash site was cold. The federal task force, now entangled in a much larger and more dangerous web of criminal activity than they had anticipated, quietly sealed off the area. The helicopter was never recovered. Its existence had become a liability, a piece of evidence that could expose not only the criminal syndicate, but also the internal corruption that had allowed these operations to flourish for so long. For years, the helicopter remained hidden, rusting and overgrown, with few knowing the real story behind it. Rumors circulated in local towns. Some said it had been a drug smuggling operation gone wrong. Others claimed it was part of a government experiment gone awry. But the truth was far simpler. It had been the price paid for greed, betrayal, and a mission that was supposed to clean up a criminal empire, but instead only added more bodies to the list of those lost in the shadows. Carol was so absorbed in the conversation that she didn't realize they were already approaching her house. They stopped in front of her door, exchanging smiles that lingered longer than either expected. Their goodbyes stretched out as if neither really wanted the moment to end. Kelsia clung tightly to Carol, wrapping her small arms around her in a way that showed she didn't want to let go. "I'll miss you, Carol," she said with a hint of sadness. Carol gently stroked Kelsey's hair, smiling warmly. "I'll miss you too, Kelsey. But we'll see each other soon, okay?" Jason stood by, watching with a soft expression. He wasn't in any rush to leave either, his usual guarded demeanor relaxed. "Thanks for today, Carol," he said quietly. "It's been a while since we've had a day like this." Carol nodded, feeling a strange mix of emotions she couldn't quite place. It was really nice, wasn't it? After what felt like an eternity, Kelsey finally let go, and together with her father, they slowly walked away toward Evelyn's house. Carol stood at her doorway, watching them for a few more moments, a newfound warmth settling in her chest. She smiled to herself, feeling something she hadn't in a long time: contentment. Just as she was about to step inside, a familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. "You see? This town really does have everything," came Maggie's teasing voice from behind. Carol turned, spotting Maggie leaning casually against the fence, a mischievous grin on her face. "Oh, Maggie, stop it!" Carol laughed, shaking her head. "Jason and I are just friends thanks to Kelsey. Don't start making assumptions." Maggie raised an eyebrow, clearly not convinced. "Just friends, huh? I saw the way you two were looking at each other. Didn't I tell you that you might find your soulmate in this little town?" Carol's cheeks flushed pink as she glanced toward the road where Jason and Kelsey were still within sight, thankfully out of earshot. Even though they couldn't hear, the thought of Maggie's teasing made her feel self-conscious. All right, Maggie said, holding up her hands in mock surrender. "I'll stop, but don't say I didn't warn you when things start heating up." She winked, her grin widening. Carol couldn't help but laugh, though she felt her face grow warmer. "You're impossible, you know that." Maggie smiled knowingly. "I've been told." After a pause, Carol's expression softened. "Honestly, Maggie, thank you. Since I've come to this town, it's like everything's been falling into place. Everyone's been so kind, including you." Maggie's playful demeanor shifted to one of sincerity. "You deserve it, Carol. You fit right in here, and you've brought your own light to this place." They continued chatting for a while longer, the conversation shifting from light-hearted banter to deeper topics about life in the town and the future. Eventually, Maggie glanced at her watch and sighed. "I should get going, but we'll catch up soon." Carol waved as Maggie disappeared down the street, then stepped back into her home. She closed the door behind her and looked around her living room, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. Everything felt different now, brighter. Her house, once a place of quiet solitude, had become a space full of warmth and potential. As she sat down, her thoughts returned to Maggie's words. She realized she hadn't properly thanked her for everything she'd done, not just today, but ever since she arrived. A smile crept onto Carol's face as an idea started to take shape. She would find a way to show her appreciation, and she already had the perfect plan forming in her mind. The following day, Carol knocked on Maggie's door, her heart racing slightly. "I was wondering if you could help me prepare a special dinner," she asked with a smile. Maggie raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "A special dinner, huh? What's the occasion?" "I've invited a couple of guests," Carol hinted, her eyes twinkling with a hint of mischief. Maggie, catching on to the implication, smiled knowingly. "Ah, I see," she replied, rolling up her sleeves. "Let's get to work." That evening, the house was warm with the smell of cooking and soft chatter. Jason and Kelsey were supposed to be Carol's honoured guests, but there was more at play. As they settled in, Carol pulled Jason aside and quietly shared her plan. Jason listened, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I'll be right back," he said, slipping out the door and making his way to his mother's house. When he finally convinced Evelyn to join them, it wasn't without some resistance. "No, Jason, we should be the ones hosting, not her." "Why did you even agree to this?" Evelyn complained, pulling on her jacket begrudgingly. Jason chuckled, shaking his head. "Mom, just go with it this time, okay? Trust me. It's more than just dinner." Back at Carol's, she and Maggie busied themselves in the kitchen, chatting about the evening ahead. They'd set up the dining area in the cozy living room, the table elegantly arranged with candles flickering in soft light. When Jason returned with Evelyn and Kelsey, he guided them to their seats with a warm smile. "I'll be right back," he said before heading into the kitchen where Carol and Maggie were adding the finishing touches to the meal. Maggie turned and smiled as Jason entered, wiping her hands on her apron. "Everything's ready," she said, picking up a bowl of fresh salad and walking toward the dining area. When she spotted Evelyn, she hesitated, unsure for a moment. Evelyn, noticing Maggie, froze as well. An awkward silence hung between them until Jason and Carol entered the room, their faces bright with anticipation. "Please, Maggie," Carol said gently, gesturing toward an empty seat at the table. "Join us." Maggie blinked in surprise, glancing down at her apron and wet hands. "Me?" she asked, caught off guard. She had assumed she was here to help, not to dine. Jason stepped forward, his eyes kind. "Yes, you, sit down. This dinner is for all of us." With a small, hesitant smile, Maggie removed her apron, wiped her hands, and sat down at the table. It wasn't until that moment that she realized she wasn't just here to help, she was a guest. She exchanged a grateful glance with Carol, her heart swelling with appreciation. Facing Evelyn and Maggie, Jason took a deep breath. "Mom, Aunt Maggie," he began, pausing to let his words sink in, "I believe it's time we put the past behind us." Evelyn's eyes immediately filled with tears, though she tried to maintain her composure. The years of unspoken hurt between the two sisters seemed to hang in the air like a heavy cloud. Carol, sensing the delicate moment, moved to Evelyn's side. Gently, she took Evelyn's hand and pulled her into a soft embrace. "Let it go," Carol whispered. "It's time." Jason caught Maggie's eye and nodded encouragingly. With slow, hesitant steps, Maggie stood up and walked toward her sister. After what felt like an eternity, she extended her arms. Evelyn, trembling, stood as well, and the two women, after 20 long years, fell into each other's arms in a heartfelt hug. The room filled with the sound of quiet sobs as the sisters clung to each other, their tears speaking more than words ever could. Jason, watching the emotional reunion, felt his own tears well up. He looked at Carol, his heart full, and as if by instinct his hand brushed against hers. Carol felt the touch, and her fingers slowly intertwined with Jason's. They stood there, hands gently squeezing, sharing a quiet moment of understanding amidst the reunion unfolding before them. Jason smiled through his tears, glancing at Carol with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered softly. Carol looked up at him, her eyes glistening, and smiled. At that moment, something indescribable filled her heart, a warmth that spread through her whole being. She felt a happiness so deep, it was almost overwhelming. And in Jason's quiet, grateful gaze, she found a connection she hadn't realized she'd been missing. As the room settled into a comfortable quiet, filled with love and new beginnings, Carol knew that something had shifted, not just for the sisters, but for her and Jason as well. The dinner that evening was filled with warmth and laughter. Maggie and Evelyn chatted non-stop, catching up on lost time as if the years of silence between them had melted away. It was a cozy scene, filled with the kind of conversations that only sisters could have, reminiscing about their childhoods, old friends, and all the small moments they'd missed. The night carried on with ease, and the bond between them grew visibly stronger. From that day forward, Jason and Carol began spending more time together, their connection deepening with each passing moment. Whether they were taking long walks by the lake, sharing quiet evenings over tea, or simply enjoying each other's company, it became clear that something beautiful was blossoming between them. Meanwhile, Maggie and Evelyn, though their bond was rekindled, took their time to fully heal the rift between them. Their afternoons were often spent sitting together on Maggie's porch, reminiscing about the past and sharing stories. One day, as they were catching up in Maggie's cozy living room, Evelyn chuckled softly and said, "You know, Mags, even when we weren't talking, I always felt connected to you. I knew about your new job, the birth of your granddaughter, and even the lemon tree you planted last summer." Maggie laughed, shaking her head in disbelief. "You mean to tell me you've been keeping tabs on me this whole time?" Evelyn smiled, a mix of mischief and love in her eyes. "Well, I couldn't help it. It seems some bonds can't be broken, even when we're stubborn about it." Maggie's laughter echoed through the house, and they both knew that despite the years of silence, their sisterly bond had always been there, waiting to be rediscovered. As for Carol, who had felt a deep void in her life after the loss of her parents, she found a new kind of solace in this warm, interconnected web of relationships. One clear afternoon, while sitting on her porch with a cup of tea in hand, she decided to call her Aunt Misty. The phone rang only once before Misty picked up. "Aunt Misty, I can't thank you enough for urging me to move here," Carol said, her voice filled with gratitude. "This town, these people, they've made me feel complete. I've found peace here." Misty's voice was warm and knowing. "I had a feeling, sweetheart. Life has a funny way of guiding us to exactly where we need to be." In the months that followed, not only did Carol's relationship with Jason deepen, but she also formed an unbreakable bond with Kelsey. They became an inseparable trio, with Chance, their loyal dog, always at their side. Whether they were enjoying quiet afternoons by the lake or playing in the yard, their little family grew closer each day. A year later, in the heart of spring, Carol and Jason made the decision to solidify their bond. They held a simple, intimate wedding in a local park, surrounded by close friends, family, and the blossoming flowers of the season. Kelsey played a special role as the flower girl, gleefully tossing petals into the air with a wide, joyous grin, while Chance trotted happily alongside her. 9 months after the wedding, their family grew a little bigger. Kelsey proudly became a big sister to a baby boy they named Adam. From the moment he was born, Kelsey took her new roles seriously. She eagerly fetched diapers, cradled him in her arms, and softly sang lullabies to her baby brother. Carol would often find Kelsey whispering secrets and stories into Adam's tiny ears, promising him a lifetime of adventures and sibling camaraderie. Evelyn, now fully embracing her role as a doting grandmother, spent as much time as she could with her grandchildren. She spoiled both Kelsey and Adam with love, stories from her own past, and the occasional sweet treat when their parents weren't looking. Her heart was full again, not just because of her family, but because of the mended bond with Maggie. The house was often filled with laughter, the sound of children playing, Evelyn's stories, and Maggie's lively conversations. It was a place of warmth, where the past was forgiven, and the future was bright with possibility. Carol, Jason, and their little family had found not just a home, but a community of love, healing, and new beginnings. Together they continued to dream, laugh, and create memories that would last for generations to come. Thank you for listening to this story. Please share your thoughts in the comments.